This is based on education, so it's going to be a really brief run-through of a lot of ideas that I've been into, and I hope it's not too either too simplistic or too kind of vague. Basically, it came out of me looking at much more generally at gender roles in early medieval society, and what I discovered was that the church had a very different perspective on what a woman should be and femininity and what it could do than you were seeing in other sources of identity. So I thought, then what was this difference, and was it the same as what they expected of men, and therefore could we see monastic life as its own separate gender? And the reason I picked this period and this society is that it was a time when Christianity was very well established, but it wasn't codified at all until just after 850 into the beginning of the 10th century. And it was a very fluid political situation with still establishing the Anglo Saxon kingdoms which formed in Britain at that time, which allowed monastic life a great deal of independence from outside control. Also significantly, this is a period of double house monasteries which men and women lived in together and participated in the same lifestyle. So, one thing I don't really go into here, which I wish I had time to, was the systematic erasure of female writing in this period, which means that we don't have very much direct evidence of how female monastic individuals saw themselves. We only have the elite male religious perspective. But having said all of that, I'm going to try and prove to you that biological men and women in monastic lives lived and participated in their society in the same way, and that this therefore cannot be seen as them performing masculinity or femininity. So, the way I'm defining gender for this is quite a very narrow constructivist definition, as completely separate not only from their biology but also their internal identity. So I'm looking at it purely as how as a way of shaping interactions with the rest of society, rather than any personal belief. Because otherwise you kind of enter into it's only useful as a structural tool, it's not actually that useful because it is obviously an anachronistic term to the period. So, also, gender is very explicitly performative here in this period. So the identity of monasticism is very, very fragile, just as I would argue masculinity and femininity are today. And the minute you are not actively performing, as it says here, actively performing monastic gender roles, you are immediately reduced. These women are suddenly seen as feminine again, even though they're still living within the same lifestyle, but because they're not wearing the right clothes, they can't be seen as monastic anymore. And because I'm looking at it this way, I'm completely hopefully moving beyond the idea of a gender binary, but also beyond the idea of a gender spectrum. So you don't have male and female and things in between. There are just social identities and how they relate to people's internal biological identities and how they relate to one another. So, because I think the problem that I found in my research was that gender historians of this period were very attached to a binary, which I personally don't see in this period, and also I think isn't a very useful way to look at the past. When you're using gender theory just as a tool for examining the past, you can't assume that, you can't just use the evidence of the 1970s and the earliest feminist historians. You have to keep up with what gender theory is actually doing right now. So, in the theory of monasticism, the main thing I focused on was this work, De Laudibus Virginitate by Aldhelm of Malmesbury, which was a poem and a prose work addressed to an abbess of a double house monastery, which therefore means it is addressed to both men and women, which has really not been picked up on by a lot of people. But both men and women here are described as, with very feminine imagery, as floral, and their chaste virtue, but also they are warriors and they are fighting. So this combination of sources of gender identity and combination of metaphors is applying to people of both biological sexes. They are being seen in the same terms. One of the things you get a lot of is the self-description by monastic individuals, obviously almost exclusively by men, is that they do see themselves, they see women in monastic roles becoming male. So they see that these women are performing the same role as them. The reason I think they are describing themselves as male, I'll go into a bit later, but yeah, what you see is they are referring to themselves as the same gender. And I think that is also a reason for the becoming male phrase, because they're existing in a very strongly patriarchal structure external to, like, obviously within Christianity, but also within the rest of society. So there is a lot of other factors, you know, becoming male is moving up in the world and becoming female is moving down and so forth. So, the audience that he's addressing, he doesn't address them using what we would expect as gendered authority structures. He addresses them as children of the church, which is a very, you know, it's not a gendered term, it's much more about age and power structures separate from sex or gender. So they're much less segregated by theory in this than they are in the much later reforms, which is a much more famous version of monasticism. So in practice, these are the three basic things you do to be a monk. You are chaste, and you don't throw parties, and you pray a lot. And all of these three sort of very major roles are equally applied to men and women. So self-restraint, particularly as chastity ties into ascetic lifestyle, it's a huge part of identity, and the point of it is it's not just that you are good, but that you are tempted and you don't involve yourself in that. So, although I will say with chastity there's a structure of the virginity which has, you can be chaste within marriage, but it's definitely seen as superior to be chaste and a virgin as well. So there is, however, the threat of sexual violence which is directed explicitly at women in the theoretical works. As well as this, so when they lived, you know, living in a monastic lifestyle, you were meant to have a hard life, you were fasting and committing penance, and there was no sexual division of labour in the monasteries that I studied. Or they were different rules. I mean, hardly any of them had established community rules, but they were, the ones that you can see were not based on biological sex. And equally, the prayers of men and women had the same value in their society. So the choice of whether you would go to a female monastic or a male was not based on their sex, it was simply based on other social factors. And it relied a lot on education as well, because you had to be able to read the Bible to participate in monastic life. And what we see is, although it has been massively erased ever since, female education in this period in monastic context was as on the same scale as male education, although that's obviously much more impacted by class and other, well, I'm going to call it class, although obviously that's another anachronistic term. And in their interactions with secular society, so for example, when in church basically, there was a kind of common unity of identity where a monastic man and a monastic woman would see themselves as unified by their superiority to the laity. There might have been internal stratifications, but in terms of their external social relationships, they were performing the same role. So, all of this adds up to they are basically doing the same thing with their lives. And does that mean then that we can say they are performing a single gender? Are they performing what is usually referred to as alternative masculinity, or as I'm saying, something completely separately? So, the sources of gender identities you've got are basically heterosexual life cycle and warfare as well for men. So, the primary thing is to have children and protect your children. And obviously, as a monk, or as a nun, although that term actually doesn't exist, and in this period there is no, nun is not a thing in Old English or in Latin, they are both referred to by the same word, which is another way to see that they're playing the same social role. You're completely detached from this like biological, physical way of interpreting your self-identity. You know, even married chastity is seen as kind of a bit sinful, borderline sinful anyway. So that if they're not sourcing their identity from the same place as the rest of society, can we say that it's an alternative form of masculinity if they've rejected all the aspects which create masculinity? And what you see instead is that religious identities are born from morality. They're particularly born from a combination of Roman influences, which are equally accessible to men and women in Anglo Saxon society because of the total collapse of the Roman Empire in Britain in the 5th century. And then coming into the 7th and 8th centuries, they're approaching these ideals on the same level as one another. There is no existing patriarchal church structure at that point, so they're able to kind of reinterpret roles a lot more freely, unlike in Southern Europe, for example. There's also the angelic model, which inspires religious identities. And in the Bible, obviously, angels don't have sex or gender. Most of them don't even have human form. So what you have instead of a physical ideal of who you could be as a man or a form of a man or a woman or a form of a woman, you have, or masculine and feminine as probably the more technical way to say that, you have the promotion of moral and intellectual values as the most important defining parts of your identity. So while they had a masculine self-perception, this was, as I said earlier, a product of other social factors and restrictions. And also, their internal identity is, I would argue, irrelevant except where it impinges on their social relationships, which, as they've just talked about, it kind of didn't. Also, another thing which I kind of came across in my research was that very few people are willing to question the validity of the self-perception as masculine by the male writers, when obviously that's going to be influenced by a lot of other factors, and particularly the context in which they're writing. So, monastic individuals, they might have been misrepresented by the nature of the surviving evidence, but they were in fact, obviously, for example, no secular people wrote their diaries down in this period. So the evidence implies that monastic superiority took place, but actually they were very much the social other, and they were rejected by their society, not treated as an alternative to it. So, having looked at all of these, I come to a couple of conclusions, which is that monastic lifestyle was not affected by biology, and they played the same social role as one another. And there is a major conflict between the idea of traditional masculinity and religious masculinity in this period, because they were so set on their separation from biological sources of identity, and women were not performing, as they were saying, the description of becoming male. Women in monastic lifestyles weren't becoming male, they were becoming monks, which is not the same thing. So you have to expand the idea of masculinity there for it to apply, to be just something that men do, but also women as well, and probably non-binary and intersex individuals all do. So that becomes so far apart from a useful definition of masculine that it's kind of pointless. It just becomes a result of just a social attachment to the binary that has no real purpose. And these social roles could be accessed by both sexes, but they weren't masculine or feminine. So then, what were they? The idea of a third gender is a simplification, obviously, because there are so many other factors affecting social roles in this period, and how one would form their identity. But it means we have the idea of multiple mutable gender identities, which kind of create a window into this period that is very much blurred by its almost exclusively male religious perspective. Any questions? Yes.
So you talk about how the monastic life can be seen as going beyond gender, but do you think that's more to do with it being something that's sexless, or more towards the spiritual side?
When you say sexless, do you mean as in the act of sex
or
having sex?
Yeah.
Which one?
The act of sex. So do you think that can only happen because the body is not being gendered in like it does in the secular world?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a very specific context. I wouldn't apply that to the modern day. I'd say there are so many other influences on gender, but because we have such a limited amount of evidence and you're kind of reduced to only the really basic background. So what we know for certain is that the feminine and the masculine they were involved in procreation. They had sex, and a lot of it, as far as I can tell, because the human race did not die out in Europe. And monks and nuns didn't. So that was kind of almost, there are other aspects of their lifestyles which got absorbed into more general pictures, but that was the kind of defining difference for me anyway.
Okay, any other questions? Yep.
Not have gendered roles, like, beyond just everyone doing the same job. So, for example, say if you have a work environment and everyone's doing the same job, but still a man might hold the door open for a woman, or talk over a woman, or interrupt her. Those sort of more subtle gendered roles, do you think there might be a place for that as well?
I think there almost definitely was. Unfortunately, I can't speak with any authority because that's like that level of detail just doesn't exist in the historical sources. But I would say in the framing of the theory, there is a lot of implications that there was still within the house, within a monastery, there was a superiority for men or women, and a lot of them did actually live under a certain degree of segregation, like spatial segregation within that lifestyle. But I can't say with any authority what form those relationships took. I can only look at the really broad brush stuff because that's the only evidence I have.
I might be wrong, but as far as I remember, nuns wouldn't be allowed to conduct services, so they would have to have a man to come and do the mass for them. Is that right?
Well, actually, that's really interesting because technically, yeah, they couldn't, but because they had such a complicated relationship with men and women both existing in the same space compared to theory and practice. So in the theory, absolutely a woman could not perform any kind, she couldn't perform mass. But within a monastic context, a lot of abbesses, particularly this originated in France and moved up to England, a lot of abbesses actually did perform aspects of the liturgy, and senior nuns would take confession from junior nuns in this period, and that's like, it's not allowed by the theology at all. But the other option was to have more male presence in this space, so they were kind of left negotiating. Either we allow for, we say these are women and these are men and they're not in the same space, or we say these ones are allowed to do the mass and these ones aren't. You can't have both at the same time. So there was like a very high level of negotiation, but yeah, while in theory women were absolutely not allowed to perform mass, they actually did in quite a few cases.
That's very interesting, because then if we think about the monastic life as a kind of manifestation of third sex, and then if in theory you're not allowed, so in theory men are still superior to women in this environment because they have sort of direct access to God as during mass, but then if you, in theory that's true, but then if in reality you're able to sort of go over that, then it's a kind of almost, or it's a kind of an example of rebellion against that, which is, I think, very interesting in terms of talking about this as an example of a third sex, or sort of escaping the binary.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's something that I would really like to know more about and go into some more, which I don't have very much knowledge, but I do know that they were able to kind of transgress that theological boundary, and then what I took that to mean was they were performing masculinity or monastic masculinity rather than existing as women in that context. Obviously, a laywoman could never become a priest, and obviously priests and monks not quite the same thing, but an abbess could perform the mass. It's really, really interesting, kind of fluid, dynamic period.